Wouter Lueks, it's your turn. You're a postdoc researcher at EPFL in the Spring Lab, the lab of Professor Carmela Troncoso. Wouter is interested in privacy, of course, in applied cryptography and in systems. He designs many systems, but they should be privacy-friendly. And most of you probably know systems he was behind, the privacy-friendly contact tracing, the protocol DP3T that was behind Swiss COVID and behind millions of phones around the world, was also designed by Wouter and the Spring Lab. So today he will talk about another project, the Datashare project. You see it there. It's also privacy preserving. It's a secure document search system for investigative journalists. But I'm sure, Wouter, you will tell us more about this. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks so much, Mirko, for the great introduction. And it's fantastic to see so many people here in this room, right? It has been a while since I think many of us did anything in an audience of this size. So it's my pleasure to talk to you about the Datashare project that we have been doing really over the past 3 or 4 years. And we have been doing this project in very close collaboration with the ICIJ, with the International Consortium for Investigative Journalists. So just in case you don't know who these people are, right? This is a consortium of journalists that have members essentially all over the world, right? This slide says 250 and over, probably a little bit more by now. And even if you have not heard of ICIJ necessarily, you probably have heard of some of their impact that they have had on the world. For example, the Panama Papers investigation, where they really managed to hold powerful entities to account. And what you see here in this type of work, so more recently of Pandora Papers, for example, is that they work on big leaked data sets, big leaked document sets that they get from a whistleblower in some areas. And I mean, in the case of Pandora Papers, these are like 11 million documents, right? That requires a lot of people power just to process that, right? To figure out what is in there. And so what the ICIJ has been doing in this context is work with a big group of journalists, like around 80 and around from 80 different countries, to just dig into these documents and get interesting information out there, right? And what is sort of key for the purpose of this talk is that this was a relatively centralized approach where the ICIJ would facilitate access to this huge pile of documents. But while doing so, they also learned that they were developing a lot of techniques to index these documents, to extract relevant information from these documents, and they realized that this would also be interested for journalists working in a much smaller scale on documents that they gathered as part of their investigations. And so they developed this Datashare system that essentially lets journalists explore what is on their machine without needing to go to a central place to do this, and then gather information about maybe entities that show up in their documents, be that people or companies or places, again, letting them do their investigative work. So now we're in the setting where they had central things, where they worked on these big investigative leaks, as well as local things where journalists would be able to work on their own documents. And of course, the way I positioned this slide, it sort of begs the obvious question, can we do something in the middle? Can we let journalists potentially benefit from documents that other journalists have, maybe search them, maybe trigger new collaborations? Because as we all know, right, the world is much more global than one would sort of think 20 years ago, right? And so there is a lot of benefit from working with a journalist in Germany or a journalist in the Netherlands that has somehow collected documents that happen to be relevant in the Swiss context. So we started talking with the ICIJ, like, can we do this and how can we do this? Because on the one hand, it is clear that there are a lot of opportunities here for collaboration. There are also a lot of risks in terms of security and privacy. And so the Spring Lab that I'm a part of is really interested in how can we design and build privacy-friendly systems. So what we did is really a long collaboration with the ICIJ where we had for 1.5 to 2 years, weekly meetings with them to figure out, okay, what are the things that you need and what are the things that we can actually build for you? And I want to just sort of, in the next 10 minutes of this presentation, walk you a little bit through the type of process that we follow and the type of thinking that goes into reasoning about this type of systems. And so here is the sort of rough ideal scenario of the process that we would like to follow. One is you figure out, what should this system do? And that's relatively simple sometimes. And then it becomes a little bit more tricky because then you start wondering about under what constraints should this work, okay? Because you cannot always get everything that we want, right? So these constraints start to matter. And then once we know what this system should do, we use a lot of our knowledge as privacy people, as security researchers, to think about, okay, suppose that you do this, suppose that you build this, what can then go wrong, right? Because a lot of things obviously can go wrong, but if you don't sort of have a structured way of figuring out what can go wrong and then think about, okay, who should we actually protect against? It becomes very difficult to do this third step, namely design a system that somehow protects you against the security and privacy risks that you identified in the second step. Now, all of this requires very close collaboration with the people that you're doing this for, in this case, ICIJ, right? And the reason is that this sort of 1, 2, 3 step process in practice is not a 1, 2, 3 step process, right? But you need to cycle like 10 times, because at some point you figure out, okay, this thing that you wanted to build, we actually don't know how to build this, okay? Like, technologists like to build stuff, but at some point you figure out, okay, we actually cannot do that and still be secure and private. So then you need to cycle around and say, okay, maybe there's something else that we can do for you. Maybe that is not quite as functional as you would have liked in the ideal world, but maybe then we can get your security and privacy properties. So there's a lot of negotiation going on. So, okay, but let's pretend for the rest of this talk that this is actually like this nice 1, 2, 3 step process that I have nicely, politely linearized for you so that you get a story that you can actually follow. So when we started talking with the ICIJ about what should this system do, right? What functionality it should offer, they did a little Q&A among their member journalists. And it turned out, okay, surprisingly, or maybe not so surprisingly, all the journalists are willing to share documents that they have collected with their fellow colleagues. That's great, right? It's a very collaborative spirit. So that was pretty positive. Now, if you look though, so the no people are essentially at 0, right? It's good. But if you look at this chart, this sharing does come with some conditions. And the condition meaning that 40% of these people, of these journalists, are willing to share, but only after they did some vetting, like did some checking. Okay, this person on the other side, who actually trusts this person, is this sort of a reasonable investigation that I want to participate in. So, and this is something that, again, right, and I cannot emphasize this enough, as sort of an academic researcher, you would just never make up this stuff, because this stuff is what happens in reality, right? But it's very hard to do, and which is really where this value is in talking with people with real challenges. So what we did then is we settled on having to somehow build a system that has 2 concrete functionalities. One functionality is, okay, we need some kind of search system. Somehow we need to be able to figure out, is there another journalist somewhere in this network of journalists that has relevant documents for me as part of my investigation? And then, once the answer to this question is somehow yes, there is then apparently a need to do some kind of screening or chatting functionality where these 2 journalists can interact with one another to decide, okay, do we actually want to go ahead and share these documents or not? So this is the things that we set out to do. So now that we have a little bit clearer about what this system should do, let's talk about what kind of risks are there in this system. And some of these are very obvious, right? Maybe, at least if you're a journalist, maybe not when you're a techie, is that both queries and documents, so the things that people search for, as well as the documents that they have collected, are potentially very sensitive. The things people search for reveal what are the topics of ongoing investigations. The documents do that as well, but might also run the risk of endangering the sources that actually gave you these documents in the first place. So whenever you build a search system like this, there is a high stakes in making sure that you do this in such a way that you can really protect both of these very well. And then finally, we also realized that the interactions between journalists themselves can be very sensitive. We want to hide from the system as a whole, or at least not leak who is talking with whom or who is collaborating with whom, and let alone about what they are collaborating. So now that we sort of established this, the next obvious question then is, who do we protect against? And so if you look at sort of the obvious parties in the system, you have journalists, no surprises there. You have the ICIJ or some other organization that runs this system. And then you have everybody else, right? And that has like law enforcement, other governmental organizations, spooks, if you wish, large corporate organizations. And then, so let's do a quick show of hands, right? Journalists, are these trustworthy? Yes? No? People are not really awake. That's a bummer, right? So,
There are journalists in the room.
there, okay. So, the typical thing that I got when asking this question, maybe not with 50 people at the same time, right, is that journalists and ICIJ typically relatively trustworthy, or at least they're sort of willing to trust each other to a large degree. Third parties, okay, so good. Now, what we know, though, from our technical work is that even though the people might be trustworthy, that doesn't necessarily go for their machines, right? Their machines might be hacked, and machines are hacked all the time. And then, even if you're sort of willing to put very good digital practices on these machines, there is other ways that you can make a journalist be slightly less trustworthy, right? You might just try to coerce a person, either through violence or other threats. And then finally, there is sort of this final thing of coercion that does not involve coercion necessarily, right, but just involves legal coercion by powerful state entities. So with that in mind, we went back to these three parties and said, okay, look, these people are typically nice, okay, but because of all these things on the previous slide, we should not assume that they are nice. And so this meant that we went ahead and tried to design a system that gets strong security and privacy properties despite all these parties being potentially operating maliciously, operating not in our own interest. So let me quickly run you through sort of the general gist of what we built. So we built a search system, right? And remember, step one is searching, step two is interacting between journalists. So here is how this searching works. All of these journalists in the system have their own document collection. So when a journalist wants to search for something, let's say Applied Machine Learning Days and Spring, to figure out who else has some gossip about the Spring Lab, a querier would send a query into the system that gets then transmitted to all the other journalist systems. In there, these systems will locally process these search queries, send the responses back, and then they go back to the querier in the end. And at that point, the querier learns, okay, there are some journalists, I called them just J1 and J4, and we'll see why in a second, that have matching documents, that have relevant information for you. Now, we did this in such a way that these queries are encrypted, so nobody on this path knows anything about these queries. Also, the responses are encrypted, so you don't learn anything about whether there are matches or not, except for the person that did the query at all. And then finally, and this is sort of where a lot of sort of the surprising crypto magic happened that I'd be happy to talk about during the lunch break, is that even these journalists and their machines don't learn anything about the queries that were made, nor the responses that were generated. So they managed to compute these responses that let this computer here at the end figure out, okay, there is a match or not, without at this point, at any way, there is any leakage about the queries. And then we did this in a similar way that actually these responses here, or whatever is derived here, doesn't leak any information about the documents that are here on the right-hand side, except for the minimal leakage that one needs to leak a search result. Cool. Now these journalists are pseudonymous. That means that there is not necessarily a name attached, but you just learn, okay, this is like number 10. And then suppose there is a match. Right now, these journalists need to talk to one another to figure out whether they actually want to go ahead and share these documents. So I already said that we want to hide what people talk about, and we also want to hide who talks with whom. And now this becomes tricky, right? Because obviously these people are going to be talking via this server here in the middle, but this server should not learn who is talking with whom because we just said that this server was not trusted. Okay? And then finally, to make things a little bit more tricky, we also wanted to hide whether people were talking at all, because that is another way to see whether investigations are going on and in which direction, right? And if you want to wonder why is this the case, imagine just a journalist in Russia at the moment, okay? Just the fact that you're collaborating in any of these systems, probably not such a good thing at the moment. So what we build is a new communication system that doesn't use any of the existing things, where journalists communicate via this server, but they do in such a way that the server cannot observe whether journalists are communicating. And then to add some extra network level anonymity, the software that we designed is actually routing all of this via Tor. So just to zoom out, so here is this big overview picture. So to step back again, what did we build? So we started off with the requirements analysis. What should this system actually be doing? Then we built this, that I didn't even tell you before, this multi-set, private set intersection cryptographic primitive think crypto magic blah blah, that hides queries, responses, as well as doesn't leak any information about documents. So this is where a lot of the magic happens. That allowed it to build a document search system. And then on top of that, we layered this anonymous communication screening thing that allowed us to then ensure that we had a system that really has nice end-to-end security and privacy properties. So just to summarize, right, we built this full decentralized privacy search engine, and there are a couple of key takeaways that I sort of want to throw out there, right? We really benefited from collaborating with the ICIJ to do this iterative requirements gathering and design process of this system. And I cannot thank, I'm not sure if there are any ICIJ people in the room, right? But if you are, thank you very much, right? Because without that, this would definitely not have been possible. So what we did more recently is we evaluated the systems that we built, and it turns out that indeed the journalists that we worked with generally prefer to use the privacy-friendly version that we designed. And most excitingly, we actually have been working over the last couple of months with ICIJ, where their engineers have actually been building a production version of this system. Now, final shameless plug of mine is that if this sounded interesting and you're thinking, there's actually other technology that I really would like to use in my day-to-day life, please come and talk to either me or Camilla Troncoso, who is heading the lab that I'm part of. Thank you so much for your attention.